Hey there! Tonight we're exploring one of humanity's most celebrated achievements, ancient irrigation systems. But forget everything you've learned about ingenious engineering and the peaceful development of agriculture. We're about to discover the reality of water management in the ancient world, where moving water from rivers to fields required backbreaking labor that killed workers by the thousands. Engineering calculations that were essentially educated guesses, and political conflicts so brutal they make modern water wars look like neighborly disputes. If you're enjoying these stories, I'd really appreciate a quick like or subscribe. It helps more than you know. Drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is there. Love seeing our little global community connect through these stories. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Congratulations. You've just woken up in ancient Mesopotamia, somewhere around the Tigris River Valley. And the first thing you notice isn't the historical significance of witnessing one of civilization's foundational technologies. It's that you're drowning in an irrigation canal while something large and reptilian circles beneath you in water that smells like a combination of river mud, human waste, and dead animals that didn't make it across the channel. The irrigation worker who pulls you from the water introduces himself as Enlil, and his weathered face and scarred hands suggest he's been doing this work long enough to have witnessed every possible disaster that canals can produce. "Welcome to irrigation duty," he says with the enthusiasm of someone announcing a funeral. "Today you help dig the new canal extension. Try not to get buried when the walls collapse, drowned when we break through to the river, or killed by the overseer when you don't move enough earth." The irrigation system around you looks nothing like the elegant engineering diagrams you might have seen in history books. It's a sprawling network of muddy trenches, crumbling earthen dams, and manually operated gates that appear to be held together by hope and periodic human sacrifice. The entire system seems designed by people who understood that crops need water, but had only the vaguest idea how to move water from rivers to fields without killing everyone involved in the process. Your first task involves joining a crew of several hundred workers who are excavating a new canal segment that will supposedly bring water to fields that are currently producing approximately nothing due to lack of irrigation. The excavation site stretches for miles across desert terrain that reaches temperatures well over 120 degrees during midday. And your tools consist of wooden shovels, woven baskets, and the kind of optimism that only comes from not yet understanding how bad things are about to get. The canal construction process reveals why ancient irrigation projects took years or decades to complete, and why so many of them were never finished. You're moving earth one basket at a time, carrying it up from trenches that get progressively deeper as excavation continues, and dumping it on levees that must be built simultaneously with channel digging to prevent the entire system from flooding uncontrollably when water is eventually introduced. The excavation method involves workers digging down to create a channel, while other workers remove the excavated soil by passing baskets up through a human chain that extends from the bottom of the trench to the levee top. This system is horrifically inefficient, brutally exhausting, and occasionally deadly when trenches collapse and bury workers who have no chance of escape from tons of falling earth. The trench collapses happen frequently enough that they're considered normal aspects of canal construction rather than avoidable accidents. The soil in this region has minimal structural integrity when excavated, meaning that any trench deeper than a few feet is constantly threatening to collapse and bury anyone working below. Support systems consist of wooden beams that are both inadequate for the task and in short supply because you're working in a region where trees are rare and expensive. Your first trench collapse occurs during your second day on the excavation crew, when a section of wall gives way and partially buries 3 workers who were digging at the bottom of the channel. The rescue effort involves more workers climbing into the unstable trench to dig out the buried men, creating additional collapse risks while everyone works frantically to reach the trapped workers before they suffocate under several feet of packed earth. 2 of the 3 buried workers survive with injuries that will probably prevent them from working again, while the third suffocates before rescuers can reach him. The overseer records the death in a ledger that apparently contains quite a few similar entries. Then, immediately orders excavation to resume, because the canal schedule doesn't include time for mourning or investigating what might have prevented the accident. The rock removal process creates additional challenges when excavation encounters stone formations that must be broken up and removed before digging can continue. The rock-breaking technology consists of heating stones with fire, then pouring water on them to create thermal shock that sometimes cracks the rocks into manageable pieces and sometimes just makes everyone wet and frustrated. The larger boulders require multiple workers using stone hammers to slowly break them into pieces small enough to be moved. A process that takes days of repetitive pounding that destroys workers' hands, arms, and shoulders, while producing results that barely justify the enormous effort involved. Rock removal often delays canal construction for weeks, while crews struggle with geological obstacles that modern equipment would eliminate in minutes. The heat exposure during canal construction creates casualties that exceed those from trench collapses and other accidents. Working in direct sun while performing physical labor in temperatures that regularly exceed 120 degrees causes heat exhaustion, heat stroke, and death from dehydration at rates that make this one of the most deadly occupations in the ancient world. Water rationing during canal construction reveals the central irony of irrigation work. You're building systems to bring water to crops while being denied adequate water for your own survival, because the overseers consider worker hydration less important than maintaining labor productivity. Workers receive minimal water rations that are insufficient for desert conditions and physical exertion, creating constant dehydration that impairs judgment and increases accident rates. The labor organization reveals a social hierarchy where workers are divided into teams based on their relationship to the state and temple authorities who control irrigation projects. Free citizens owe labor service as a form of taxation, performing mandatory corvée duty that takes them away from their own farms for months at a time. Debt slaves work off financial obligations through irrigation labor that they may never complete. War captives and criminals are worked to death on the most dangerous assignments. Your position in this hierarchy is unclear, but Enlil explains that you're probably classified as corvée labor, meaning you owe a certain number of days of work, but theoretically retain some rights and will eventually be released to return to whatever life you had before waking up in an irrigation canal. This sounds better than permanent enslavement, until you realize that the casualty rates for corvée workers are high enough that many don't survive to see their release dates. The daily work schedule begins before dawn and continues until darkness makes excavation too dangerous to continue. Typically 12 to 16 hours of continuous physical labor with minimal breaks for food or rest. There are no days off, no sick leave, and certainly no workers' compensation when injuries occur. The overseers maintain productivity through physical punishment, public humiliation, and occasional executions of workers who fail to meet excavation quotas. The soil removal quotas require each worker to excavate and transport a specific volume of earth daily, with the volume calculated based on what the fastest, strongest workers can achieve rather than what average workers can sustain. This creates a system where most workers fall behind quotas and face punishment, while exhaustion and heat exposure steadily reduce everyone's productivity throughout the excavation season. The levee construction that occurs simultaneously with channel excavation requires precise placement of soil to create barriers that will contain water flow without collapsing or eroding when the irrigation system becomes operational. The construction techniques involve compacting soil through trampling and wetting, creating earthen dams that are marginally functional and frequently fail when tested by actual water pressure. Water theft from completed portions of the irrigation system reveals the desperation that drives much of the conflict around canal construction. Farmers whose fields aren't receiving adequate water open unauthorized channels to divert flow, while other farmers sabotage those illegal channels to protect their own water access. These conflicts frequently escalate to violence, with irrigation disputes resulting in murders that local authorities seem to consider inevitable consequences of water scarcity. As your first week on canal construction ends, you've moved thousands of baskets of earth, witnessed multiple fatal accidents, and developed understanding of why ancient texts describe irrigation projects as monumental achievements that required generations of effort. You've also acquired sunburn that has progressed to sun poisoning, dehydration symptoms that include confusion and muscle cramps, and the beginning of repetitive stress injuries that will worsen with continued excavation work. Tonight, you'll sleep in a work camp that provides minimal shelter and inadequate food, surrounded by other workers who are all suffering from similar physical problems, while knowing that tomorrow brings more of the same labor that's slowly destroying everyone's health. Your dreams will be filled with images of collapsing trenches and endless baskets of earth. And you'll wake up to discover that the reality is actually worse than your nightmares suggested. Welcome to the world of ancient irrigation, where humanity's transition from hunting and gathering to settled agriculture required moving earth on a scale that wouldn't be matched until modern mechanized construction, while using only human muscle power, primitive tools, and the kind of desperate determination that comes from knowing that without irrigation, everyone starves. Your second week in the irrigation construction crew begins with a discovery that transforms your understanding of why so many ancient canal systems failed catastrophically. The engineers designing your irrigation network have no idea what they're doing. They're making critical decisions about water flow, channel gradients, and structural integrity based on religious divination, ancestral tradition, and pure guesswork that would get modern engineers immediately stripped of their licenses and possibly arrested for criminal negligence. The morning briefing involves the chief engineer, a priest named Naram Sin, whose qualifications apparently include interpreting sheep entrails and having a grandfather who once successfully built a canal that lasted almost 3 years before washing away an entire village. He's explaining today's work assignments while consulting clay tablets that contain calculations so wrong they violate basic laws of physics that won't be discovered for another 3,000 years. The canal must drop exactly 1 finger width for every 100 paces. Naram Sin announces with the confidence of someone who has no idea that water flow depends on gradients that cannot be measured accurately using body parts and walking distances. The gods have revealed through sacred rituals that this gradient will bring sufficient water to the fields while preventing destructive flooding. The measurement techniques that ancient irrigation engineers use would be rejected by modern middle school science projects. Distances are measured in paces, which vary depending on who's walking. Elevations are determined by eyeballing and making educated guesses about relative height differences that might matter by several feet over the course of miles. Angles are approximated using techniques that assume water will cooperate with human expectations about how fluids should behave. The surveying tools available to canal engineers consist of weighted strings, wooden measuring rods, and water-filled channels that theoretically show level surfaces but actually show wherever water happens to settle when influenced by surface tension, imperfect containers, and environmental conditions that nobody understands. These tools produce measurements with error margins large enough to make completed canals useless for their intended purposes. The gradient calculation errors become apparent when you help construct a channel section that's supposed to carry water from an intake point to fields several miles away. The engineer's calculations suggest that gravity will move water along the channel at rates sufficient for irrigation. But the actual gradient is so minimal that water will barely flow at all, creating stagnant pools that breed disease rather than irrigate crops. Flow rate management represents another area where ancient engineering meets wishful thinking and produces disasters. The engineers calculate water volumes based on visual observations of river flow during specific seasons, then design canal capacities that will supposedly deliver appropriate amounts of water to fields. These calculations ignore seasonal variations, siltation effects, and the basic reality that water doesn't always behave the way priests think it should. The intake structure your crew is building demonstrates the consequences of engineering without mathematics. The structure is supposed to divert a portion of river flow into the canal system while allowing excess water and sediment to continue downstream. The design is based entirely on previous structures that sort of worked sometimes, with dimensions copied from memory and adjusted based on religious significance of certain numbers rather than hydraulic principles. Volume estimation for canal capacity involves looking at existing channels, guessing how much water they carry, and building new channels that seem roughly similar in size. This method produces irrigation systems, where some sections carry far too much water and flood surrounding areas, while other sections carry insufficient water and leave fields dry. Nobody can predict which problem will occur where, because the calculation methods are fundamentally incapable of producing accurate results. The foundation failures that plague irrigation construction reveal why so many ancient canal systems lasted only a few years before requiring complete reconstruction. The engineers don't understand soil mechanics, load-bearing capacity, or the effects of water saturation on earthen structures. They build dams and levees that look solid but collapse when tested by actual water pressure. Your crew spends days constructing a dam intended to raise water levels for canal intake, using compacted earth and whatever rocks can be found nearby. The construction follows traditional methods that have been passed down for generations, which means you're repeating mistakes that have been killing people and destroying infrastructure for centuries without anyone recognizing that the traditional methods are fundamentally flawed. The dam completion ceremony involves religious rituals intended to ensure structural integrity through divine favor, which would be more reassuring if the previous 3 dams built at this location hadn't all failed within months of construction. The priests sacrifice animals, pour libations, and invoke gods whose actual responsibilities probably don't include compensating for inadequate engineering, while the workers who actually built the dam nervously watch the water level rise and wonder how long before this structure joins its predecessors in catastrophic failure. Erosion control represents another engineering challenge that ancient builders address through methods that are approximately as effective as praying for the erosion to stop. Channel walls are supposed to resist water flow that constantly undermines earthen structures. But the reinforcement techniques consist of placing reeds along channel bottoms and hoping that plant roots will stabilize soil that's actively being washed away. The channel maintenance requirements that result from inadequate erosion control mean that irrigation systems require constant repair work that consumes enormous amounts of labor. Every flood season damages channels that must be rebuilt. Every sandstorm fills channels that must be dredged. And every structural failure creates emergency repairs that take precedence over scheduled construction. Wildlife encounters add unpredictable dangers to the already hazardous work of canal construction. The channels you're building create new water sources that attract every animal in the region, including species that consider humans to be either threats or potential meals. Crocodiles from the river establish territories in completed canal sections, making maintenance work potentially fatal for anyone who has to enter the water. The crocodile problem becomes personal when you're assigned to a crew clearing vegetation from a channel section and discover that you're sharing the workspace with a reptile that's longer than you are tall and significantly more comfortable in aquatic environments. The standard procedure for dealing with crocodiles apparently involves hoping they're not hungry and trying to work quickly enough that they don't notice you're there. Venomous snakes find the moist environments around canals ideal for hunting the rodents and frogs that are also attracted to irrigation channels. Your crew encounters snakes regularly, and the treatment for snake bites consists of folk remedies that are completely ineffective against neurotoxins and hemotoxins. But at least give victims something to focus on while they're dying from envenomation. Disease vectors multiply in irrigation systems that create perfect breeding grounds for mosquitoes carrying malaria, flies spreading various infections, and parasites that cause diseases medieval medicine doesn't understand and cannot treat. The standing water in poorly flowing channels becomes biological hazard zones, where workers are constantly exposed to pathogens that will shorten their lives, even if construction accidents don't kill them first. The parasitic infections that spread through irrigation workers include schistosomiasis, a disease caused by flatworms that penetrate human skin in contaminated water and cause chronic illness that debilitates entire populations. Workers develop symptoms that include bloody urine, organ damage, and eventually death from complications that ancient medicine attributes to curses or moral failings rather than waterborne parasites. Seasonal flooding demonstrates why irrigation engineering is so challenging in regions where river levels vary dramatically throughout the year. The canals that work adequately during normal flow periods become catastrophically inadequate during flood seasons, when water volumes increase by orders of magnitude and destroy infrastructure that took years to build. Your crew witnesses a flood event that occurs when heavy rainfall in distant mountains sends a surge of water down the river system. Overwhelming intake structures and flooding channels that were designed for much smaller water volumes. The flood destroys miles of completed canal work, kills workers who were maintaining channel sections, and deposits enough silt in the system to require months of dredging before irrigation can resume. Drought periods create opposite problems when river levels drop below intake elevations and channels designed to carry water by gravity become useless because there's no water to carry. The irrigation systems that enable agriculture during normal conditions provide nothing during droughts, leaving fields to dry up while the infrastructure sits empty and useless. Temperature extremes affect canal function in ways that ancient engineers don't anticipate. In colder regions, irrigation channels freeze solid during winter, making water delivery impossible for months, while ice damage cracks channel walls and destroys control structures. In desert regions, evaporation losses mean that channels must carry far more water than fields actually need because significant portions never reach their intended destinations. Sandstorms fill channels with wind-blown sand that must be removed before irrigation can resume, creating maintenance work that's never finished because new sandstorms arrive before crews complete. Dredging from previous storms. The cycle of filling and dredging means that some canal systems spend more time non-functional than operational. As your second week ends, you understand that ancient irrigation represents humanity's attempt to control natural water systems, using technology that's barely adequate for the task and engineering knowledge that's fundamentally insufficient for the challenges involved. The irrigation systems that eventually succeed do so not because of brilliant engineering, but because enough failures eventually produce designs that work adequately, despite violating principles that engineers haven't discovered yet. Tonight, you'll sleep, knowing that the canal you're building has approximately the same chance of functioning properly as it does of catastrophically failing and killing everyone downstream. Tomorrow will bring more construction work based on calculations that are essentially religious faith disguised as mathematics. And you'll continue moving Earth according to plans developed by people whose primary qualification is ancestor worship rather than engineering expertise. The ancient irrigation systems that survive to be studied by archaeologists represent the tiny fraction of projects that worked despite inadequate engineering. While the vast majority of attempts failed completely and disappeared from historical records along with the civilizations that depended on them. Your third week in the irrigation construction crew begins with a lesson in political reality that makes the engineering challenges seem trivial by comparison. Water rights are more important than human rights, and irrigation systems aren't just agricultural infrastructure. They're weapons of war, tools of oppression, and the foundation for political power structures that treat human lives as expendable resources in the eternal struggle for water control. The morning starts with news that travels through the work camp like wildfire. The city upstream has diverted more river flow into their canal system, reducing water availability for downstream communities that include the region you're currently trying to irrigate. This isn't a natural disaster or engineering failure. It's deliberate political action that could lead to famine, economic collapse, and quite possibly open warfare between cities that are nominally part of the same civilization. Enlil explains the situation with the weary resignation of someone who's seen this conflict play out multiple times. Upstream controls the water. Downstream suffers the consequences, he says, while gesturing toward the river that's now carrying noticeably less flow than it did yesterday. Sometimes we negotiate. Sometimes we sabotage their canals. Sometimes we go to war. But we always fight over water, because everything else depends on it. The upstream-downstream conflict represents one of history's oldest and most persistent political problems. Cities located higher on river systems can divert water before it reaches downstream communities, giving them enormous leverage over neighbors who depend on the same water sources. This geographic advantage translates into political power that shapes regional alliances, trade relationships, and military conflicts. The water rights system that governs irrigation operates according to principles that prioritize political power over equity or efficiency. The most powerful cities and the wealthiest landowners receive guaranteed water allocations, while smaller communities and poor farmers compete for whatever remains after privileged users take their shares. The system is designed to concentrate political power rather than maximize agricultural productivity or serve the greatest number of people. Your construction project exists within this political context. Building infrastructure that's supposed to bring water to fields controlled by a coalition of landowners who have sufficient political influence to command state resources for their benefit. The workers doing the actual construction are mostly poor farmers and conscripted laborers who will receive little or no benefit from the system they're risking their lives to build. Canal sabotage becomes a regular occurrence as communities engage in water wars that are fought through infrastructure destruction rather than direct military confrontation. The channels your crew has spent weeks constructing are vulnerable to deliberate breaches that release water uncontrollably and destroy the very systems that took enormous effort to create. Your first experience with canal sabotage occurs in the middle of the night when someone upstream opens an unauthorized breach that floods your work site and destroys several weeks of construction progress. The floodwaters arrive without warning, sweeping through the worker camp and drowning several people who were sleeping in low-lying areas. The flood also destroys tools, food supplies, and construction materials that cannot be easily replaced. The response to this sabotage reveals the brutality that underlies water politics. The authorities send military forces to the upstream location where the breach occurred, and they return with prisoners who are publicly tortured and executed as examples to discourage future sabotage attempts. The executions are conducted at the work site so all laborers can witness the consequences of interfering with state irrigation projects. Siege tactics using water control demonstrate how irrigation systems function as military infrastructure. Cities can be conquered not by storming their walls but by cutting off their water supplies, creating conditions where populations either surrender or die from thirst. The same canal systems that enable agriculture become tools for warfare that are more effective than conventional weapons. The forced labor system that provides workers for irrigation construction represents legalized slavery that's justified through religious and political ideologies, claiming that water management is so important it supersedes individual rights and freedoms. The corvée system requires all citizens to provide unpaid labor for state projects, with the burden falling most heavily on poor farmers who can least afford to lose time from their own fields. Your legal status as corvée laborer means you're required to work on irrigation projects for a certain number of days each year, with the actual duration determined by overseers who have strong incentives to keep workers for as long as possible. The corvée obligation is supposedly limited, but enforcement is arbitrary, and workers who complete their required service are often forced to continue working through threats, intimidation, or simple refusal to release them. Debt bondage provides another source of irrigation labor, with people who owe money to creditors or the state being forced to work off their debts through construction service. The system is designed to make debt repayment nearly impossible, with workers earning token wages that barely cover their living expenses, while their debt obligations continue, accumulating interest that ensures permanent servitude. Family conscription extends forced labor beyond individuals to entire households, with irrigation officials demanding that families provide multiple workers simultaneously. This creates situations where entire families work on construction projects while their own farms go untended, leading to economic hardship that often results in debt that requires even more forced labor to repay. Punishment details assign criminals and political prisoners to the most dangerous irrigation work, effectively using canal construction as a form of execution that maintains plausible deniability about state violence. The prisoners are worked under conditions designed to kill them through exhaustion, accidents, and exposure, while officially they're simply performing labor service that unfortunately proves fatal to those with insufficient stamina or dedication. Child labor in irrigation construction includes children as young as 6 or 7 who are forced to work alongside adults, performing tasks that are dangerous for experienced workers and usually fatal for children who lack the size, strength, and judgment to protect themselves. The children work because their families need whatever minimal compensation is provided, or because they're orphans with no other options, or because the state simply conscripts them along with everyone else. Your crew includes several children who are nominally doing light work, like carrying water to adult workers, but who are actually performing dangerous tasks because overseers don't distinguish between child and adult labor requirements. You witness a child fall into a partially completed channel and drown before anyone can reach him, with his death recorded as an unfortunate accident rather than the predictable result of forcing children to work in hazardous conditions. The compensation system for forced labor provides minimal payment that's calculated to keep workers alive without giving them resources to escape irrigation service. Workers receive food rations that prevent immediate starvation but cause chronic malnutrition, housing that provides minimal shelter while concentrating workers in crowded, unsanitary conditions, and occasional token wages that are insufficient to save money or improve their situations. Escape attempts from forced labor are treated as serious crimes that carry death penalties for the workers who flee and often for their families who remain behind. Guards patrol work sites with instructions to kill anyone attempting to leave without authorization, and they're empowered to use whatever force they consider necessary to prevent labor shortages that might delay construction schedules. Religious control over irrigation manifests through temple ownership of water resources and priestly monopolies on engineering knowledge that's classified as sacred information unavailable to common people. The temples control major canal systems, charge fees for water access, and use their position as water gatekeepers to extract wealth from everyone who depends on irrigation for survival. The religious taxation system requires farmers to pay temples for water access, with payments calculated as percentages of harvest yields that ensure temples capture significant shares of agricultural production. The payments are justified through religious ideology, claiming that gods own all water and humans merely rent access through proper ritual observance and financial contributions to religious institutions. Ritual requirements for irrigation projects include expensive ceremonies, animal sacrifices, and priestly interventions at every stage of construction. The ceremonies don't improve engineering outcomes, but they're mandatory expenses that increase project costs while enriching religious institutions that control both spiritual and material aspects of water management. Human sacrifice in connection with irrigation projects occurs during foundation ceremonies, flood control rituals, and emergency responses to canal failures. The sacrifices are justified through religious beliefs, claiming that gods require human blood to ensure successful water management, creating situations where irrigation success is measured not just in engineering terms, but in body counts of sacrificial victims. Legal brutality surrounding water crimes reflects how seriously ancient societies treat irrigation offenses. The Code of Hammurabi and similar legal systems prescribe death penalties for canal damage, whether accidental or intentional. The laws assume that any interference with irrigation systems threatens community survival and therefore justifies extreme punishment. Collective punishment extends legal responsibility beyond individuals to their families, villages, and social networks. When someone damages a canal, authorities might execute not just the offender but their relatives, neighbors, and anyone else they decide shares responsibility. This creates communities where everyone polices everyone else's behavior around irrigation systems. Property confiscation allows authorities to seize land, assets, and even people as punishment for water crimes. A farmer who diverts water without authorization might lose not just water rights but their entire farm, family members who become state slaves, and any assets that can be liquidated to compensate for the violation. As your third week ends, you understand that irrigation politics transforms water from a natural resource into a tool of oppression that concentrates power, enables exploitation, and generates conflicts that shape the rise and fall of entire civilizations. The canal you're building isn't just agricultural infrastructure, it's a physical manifestation of political relationships built on forced labor, violent enforcement, and systematic inequality. Tonight, you'll sleep knowing that the water flowing through completed portions of your canal system carries not just agricultural potential, but the tears of enslaved workers, the blood of executed saboteurs, and the sweat of children who will probably die before reaching adulthood. Tomorrow will bring more construction work in service of a political system that treats human beings as expendable components in irrigation machines designed to serve the interests of people who will never touch a shovel or risk their lives in collapsing trenches. The politics of water reveals that irrigation systems represent not human triumph over nature, but human exploitation of other humans in the name of agricultural productivity that primarily benefits those who control water access, rather than those who do the actual work. Your fourth week in the irrigation construction crew begins not with political conflicts or engineering failures, but with something far more insidious and deadly: the realization that the canal system you're building is also constructing a perfect disease transmission network that will kill more people than all the construction accidents, political executions, and forced labor combined. The irrigation channels that bring life-giving water to crops are simultaneously creating biological highways for pathogens, parasites, and disease vectors that will devastate human populations for generations. The morning starts with a medical inspection that consists of a priest walking through the work camp and identifying anyone who looks too sick to work effectively. The inspection isn't motivated by concern for worker health, but by desire to remove anyone whose illness might spread to healthy workers and reduce productivity. The sick are segregated into an area of camp that everyone calls the death tent, where they'll either recover enough to return to work or die without receiving any medical care that might actually help them. Enlil pulls you aside before the inspection reaches your section of camp. Don't show weakness. Don't mention feeling ill. And definitely don't let them see if you're bleeding or vomiting, he warns while checking you for visible symptoms. The death tent is where workers go to die, not to get better. Medical treatment is expensive and workers are cheap, so they don't waste resources treating people who might not survive anyway. The waterborne disease epidemic that spreads through irrigation construction crews makes modern sanitation engineers weep at the systematic violation of every public health principle. The same water sources that workers drink from are contaminated with human waste, animal carcasses, and runoff from agricultural fields where workers relieve themselves because there are no sanitation facilities provided at construction sites. Cholera outbreaks occur regularly when bacteria from infected waste contaminate water supplies that desperate workers drink because dehydration from physical labor in desert heat makes water consumption non-negotiable, even when the bacterious water is visibly contaminated. The cholera causes severe diarrhea and vomiting that dehydrate victims so rapidly they can die within hours of symptom onset. And the disease spreads through camps with terrifying speed because sanitation practices are non-existent. Your first encounter with cholera comes when the worker sleeping next to you in the communal shelter develops symptoms during the night and dies before morning. Having suffered through hours of violent illness that left him severely dehydrated, despite drinking whatever water he could obtain. The other workers move his body outside the shelter and return to sleep, because death from disease is so common that it no longer merits significant attention or disruption of rest periods. Dysentery affects virtually everyone who works on irrigation construction, causing chronic diarrhea, abdominal pain, and blood and stool that indicates intestinal damage from bacterial or parasitic infections. The dysentery is so universal that workers consider constant digestive problems to be normal aspects of canal construction rather than recognizing them as symptoms of preventable diseases caused by contaminated water and absent sanitation. The medical understanding of dysentery attributes the disease to bad air, divine punishment, or imbalanced bodily humors, rather than recognizing waterborne pathogens as the actual cause. The treatments involve herbal remedies that provide no benefit, religious rituals that waste resources, and dietary restrictions that often worsen malnutrition among workers who are already receiving inadequate food. Typhoid fever spreads through irrigation camps when salmonella bacteria contaminate water supplies, causing high fevers, weakness, and delirium in infected workers. The disease progression includes intestinal complications that can cause fatal perforations, while survivors often become chronic carriers who continue spreading the disease even after their own symptoms resolve. The typhoid cases you witness reveal the complete inadequacy of ancient medicine for treating serious bacterial infections. Victims suffer through weeks of high fever that causes brain damage and dehydration, while medical treatment consists of cooling baths that do nothing to address the underlying infection and herbal preparations that might reduce fever symptoms without affecting disease progression. Parasitic infections represent the most insidious health threat facing irrigation workers because the parasites establish chronic infections that persist for years and cause progressive disability that gradually reduces workers' capacity for physical labor. The parasites enter through contaminated water, penetrate skin during wading in channels, or are ingested through food prepared with contaminated water. Schistosomiasis, caused by flatworms whose larvae penetrate human skin in contaminated water, becomes epidemic among irrigation workers who must wade through channels during construction and maintenance. The larvae migrate through the bloodstream to various organs, where adult worms establish chronic infections that cause blood and urine, organ damage, and eventually death from complications including liver failure, kidney disease, and bladder cancer. Your own exposure to schistosomiasis occurs during routine work in a partially completed channel where you're standing ankle-deep in water that contains invisible parasite larvae. The infection process is painless, and you don't notice anything wrong until weeks later when you develop symptoms that ancient medicine will attribute to curses or moral failings rather than recognizing them as parasitic disease. Guinea worm infection demonstrates how irrigation systems create health disasters that persist for generations. The parasite larvae live in water and are ingested when people drink contaminated water from channels, wells, or storage vessels. The larvae develop into adult worms that grow up to 3 feet long inside human tissues, then emerge through painful skin ulcers that take months to heal and often become infected. The treatment for guinea worm involves slowly winding the emerging worm around a stick over the course of days or weeks, being careful not to break the worm because fragments left inside the body cause severe infections. Workers suffering from guinea worm continue working because there's no disability leave. So you witness colleagues performing physical labor while 3-foot parasites slowly emerge from their legs or feet. Mosquito-borne diseases multiply when irrigation systems create standing water that provides ideal breeding habitat for mosquitoes carrying malaria, dengue fever, and other pathogens. The mosquito populations explode around irrigation construction sites, creating disease transmission rates that overwhelm human immune systems and make illness essentially universal among workers. Malaria becomes endemic in irrigation regions, with workers experiencing recurring bouts of fever, chills, and weakness that correspond to parasite life cycles in their bloodstreams. The repeated malaria episodes cause cumulative damage that includes anemia, organ dysfunction, and neurological problems. While pregnant women face particularly high risks of miscarriage and stillbirth from malaria infection, the environmental destruction caused by irrigation construction extends beyond disease transmission to include fundamental alterations of regional ecosystems that have permanent consequences for agricultural sustainability and human health. The most serious problem is salinization, the accumulation of salt in irrigated soils that eventually makes agricultural production impossible. Salinization occurs when irrigation water evaporates from soil surfaces, leaving behind dissolved salts that concentrate in root zones and create toxic conditions for most crop plants. The process is gradual and initially invisible, but it's also irreversible using ancient technology, meaning that every irrigation system is slowly but steadily destroying the agricultural capacity it was built to enable. Your crew is building canals in regions where previous irrigation systems failed due to salinization. Though nobody recognizes this pattern because the connection between irrigation and salt accumulation won't be understood for thousands of years. The ruins of abandoned cities and empty fields that surround your construction site represent previous civilizations that prospered briefly through irrigation before soil salinization made agriculture impossible and forced population abandonment. Soil exhaustion from continuous cropping without adequate fertilization or crop rotation depletes nutrients that plants need for growth, creating declining agricultural yields that farmers attempt to compensate for through expanded irrigation that accelerates salinization and hastens the eventual collapse of agricultural productivity. Over-irrigation creates waterlogging problems, where soil pores fill with water and exclude oxygen that plant roots need for respiration. The waterlogged soils become anoxic environments where only specialized plants can survive. While crops die from root suffocation and fields become unusable for agriculture, despite receiving plenty of water. Wetland destruction occurs when natural marshes and swamps are drained to create irrigated farmland, eliminating ecosystems that provided flood control, water purification, wildlife habitat, and resources that previous populations depended on for survival. The wetland destruction creates immediate agricultural gains that mask long-term ecological losses. Groundwater depletion happens when irrigation systems extract water from aquifers faster than precipitation can replenish them, creating water mining rather than sustainable water use. The groundwater levels drop steadily as irrigation continues, making wells progressively deeper and more expensive until they eventually run dry and leave regions without adequate water supplies. The social collapse that follows irrigation failure demonstrates how agricultural societies become dependent on water management systems that are fundamentally unsustainable. When irrigation systems fail due to salinization, siltation, or groundwater depletion, the populations they supported face starvation, economic ruin, and forced migration because they've lost the knowledge and infrastructure needed for pre-irrigation survival strategies. Population displacement from failed irrigation regions creates refugee crises as desperate people abandon their homes and migrate to regions with functional water systems. These migrations generate conflicts with existing populations, spread diseases to new areas, and create social instability that can trigger the collapse of civilizations that seemed prosperous before irrigation. Failures cascaded into regional catastrophes, Economic ruin from irrigation collapse affects not just farmers whose fields become unproductive, but entire urban populations whose livelihoods depend on agricultural surpluses. The merchants, craftsmen, and administrators who comprised ancient middle classes find their services unnecessary when agricultural production fails, creating economic depressions that are fundamentally different from modern recessions because they're based on environmental collapse rather than financial dynamics. Famine cascades from irrigation failure start with crop failures in directly affected regions but spread throughout trade networks as food scarcity drives up prices. Hoarding reduce available supplies, and political conflicts prevent food distribution to areas experiencing shortages. The famines kill through starvation, but also through diseases that exploit malnutrition to cause epidemics among weakened populations. Cultural destruction accompanies environmental and economic collapse as civilizations abandon regions that can no longer support dense populations. The accumulated knowledge, artistic achievements, and social institutions that developed over centuries disappear within generations as populations disperse and survivors focus on immediate survival rather than preserving cultural heritage. As your fourth week ends, you understand that irrigation construction isn't just building water delivery systems, but creating time bombs that will eventually destroy the civilizations they're meant to support. The canal you're building might enable agricultural prosperity for decades or even centuries, but it's also establishing conditions that guarantee eventual collapse through processes that ancient people cannot predict or prevent. Tonight, you'll sleep with multiple parasitic infections, chronic dysentery, probable malaria, and the knowledge that the irrigation system consuming your health will eventually destroy the society it's designed to serve. Tomorrow will bring more construction work on infrastructure that represents both humanity's greatest agricultural achievement and its most catastrophic environmental mistake. The disease, death, and desperation surrounding ancient irrigation reveal the true price of agricultural intensification, measured in shortened lifespans, epidemic diseases, and the slow destruction of the environmental systems that make human civilization possible. Your fifth and final week in the irrigation construction crew doesn't begin with the usual sounds of workers digging channels and moving earth. It begins with silence, broken only by wind blowing across abandoned fields where crops once grew before the irrigation system that took generations to build finally failed completely. You've been transported forward several decades to witness the inevitable conclusion of the canal project you helped construct: total agricultural collapse, mass population displacement, and the transformation of a once prosperous civilization into archaeological ruins that future scholars will study while wondering what went wrong. The irrigation system that consumed so many lives and so much labor has reached its end game. Though the failure didn't happen suddenly, it was a gradual decline that began almost as soon as the system became operational, accelerating over decades as multiple interconnected problems combined to transform agricultural infrastructure into mechanisms of civilizational collapse. The canals still exist physically, but they no longer deliver water to fields that have become too salty to support crops. Enlil, now an old man whose body shows decades of irrigation work in the form of permanent disabilities and chronic health problems, walks with you through the abandoned city that once thrived on agricultural surpluses produced by the canal system. "We built this," he says, gesturing toward empty streets and crumbling buildings. "We moved mountains of earth, diverted rivers, and transformed deserts into gardens. And it worked. For a while. Then the water stopped working. The soil stopped working. And everything we built became useless. The salinization process that destroyed this civilization's agricultural capacity was invisible at first, manifesting as subtle reductions in crop yields that farmers initially attributed to weather variations, pest problems, or insufficient irrigation. The white salt crusts that eventually appeared on field surfaces represented the visible end stage of a process that had been destroying soil fertility for decades, while everyone focused on maintaining and expanding the irrigation system. The mechanism of salinization is straightforward in retrospect. Irrigation water contains dissolved salts that remain in the soil when water evaporates or is absorbed by plants. In regions with adequate rainfall, these salts are flushed downward through the soil profile and carried away by groundwater. In arid regions where irrigation provides the only water input, the salts have nowhere to go and accumulate steadily in the root zone until concentrations become toxic to crop plants. The fields you once helped irrigate now display thick white crusts of accumulated salts that make them look like they're covered in frost. Except the frost never melts, and nothing can grow in soil that's been transformed into a salty desert, more hostile to plant life than the original desert was before irrigation development. The salinization is irreversible, using ancient technology, meaning these fields will remain agricultural wastelands for centuries or millennia until geological processes eventually flush the accumulated salts from the soil profile. Silt accumulation created additional problems that combined with salinization to accelerate system failure. The irrigation channels that required constant dredging during their operational period eventually filled with sediment faster than work crews could remove it, reducing water delivery capacity and causing floods that damaged both infrastructure and agricultural land. The siltation problem originated with deforestation in upland watersheds, where erosion increased dramatically after forests were cleared for timber and agricultural expansion. The eroded soil traveled downstream and settled in irrigation channels, creating maintenance requirements that exceeded available labor capacity and financial resources. The civilization essentially mined its own topsoil and deposited it in canals that became useless as water delivery systems. Structural failure of the irrigation infrastructure itself contributed to system collapse as earthen dams and levees that were never adequately maintained deteriorated beyond the point where repairs could restore functionality. The structures that took years to build and required constant maintenance to survive eventually failed when economic problems reduced the resources available for infrastructure maintenance. The catastrophic dam failures that occurred as structures deteriorated released massive floods that destroyed downstream communities, killed thousands of people, and damaged agricultural land through erosion and silt deposition. These failures demonstrated that irrigation infrastructure creates permanent maintenance obligations that civilizations must meet indefinitely or face consequences that can destroy the societies that depend on the systems. Water table collapse represents the most fundamental form of irrigation failure, occurring when groundwater extraction exceeds aquifer recharge rates and water levels drop below the depths that ancient well-digging technology could reach. The groundwater depletion happened gradually as generations of farmers dug wells deeper and deeper to reach falling water tables, until eventually the water became inaccessible and entire regions lost their ability to support agriculture or human settlement. The wells that once provided supplemental water for irrigation and drinking are now dry holes that extend hundreds of feet into the earth without reaching water, representing enormous investments of labor that produced nothing because the aquifer had been mined to depletion. The groundwater that took thousands of years to accumulate was consumed in decades, leaving future generations without the water resources that enabled civilization development. Climate change during this civilization's final decades exacerbated all the other problems by reducing rainfall in upland watersheds, decreasing river flows, and increasing evaporation rates that accelerated salinization. The climate shifts weren't dramatic enough to cause immediate catastrophe, but they reduced the margin of error for water management to the point where the irrigation systems that worked adequately under previous climate conditions became inadequate under the new conditions. The river that provided water for the entire irrigation network carries noticeably less flow than it did during your construction period, with water levels dropping low enough that intake structures built to capture river water now sit above the water surface during much of the year. The reduced river flow means that even if the soil salinization and silt accumulation problems could be solved, insufficient water exists to operate the irrigation system at the capacity it was designed for. Mass migration from the failed irrigation region created one of history's great population displacements. With hundreds of thousands of people abandoning their homes and moving to regions with functional water supplies or reverting to nomadic lifestyles that don't require permanent water infrastructure. The migration dispersed the population that had concentrated around irrigation agriculture, destroying the urban civilization that agricultural surpluses had enabled. The refugee populations that fled the collapsing irrigation region carried diseases with them to new areas, creating epidemics in regions that previously had minimal disease burdens. They also competed with existing populations for limited resources, generating conflicts that destabilized multiple regions and contributed to broader patterns of civilizational collapse across the entire region. Urban decay accompanied agricultural collapse as cities that depended on irrigation-based food supplies found themselves without the resources needed to sustain dense populations. The urban populations that once numbered in the tens of thousands dwindled to small groups of survivors living in the ruins of buildings that were constructed during periods of prosperity that now seem like impossible dreams. The magnificent temples, palaces, and public buildings that were constructed using surpluses from irrigation agriculture now stand empty and slowly crumbling, their architectural grandeur serving mainly to emphasize the scale of the civilization that created them and the completeness of its collapse. The buildings were constructed to last for centuries, and they probably will. But they'll serve as monuments to failed ambition rather than functioning components of living civilizations. Agricultural collapse transformed productive farmland back into desert. But desert that's actually more hostile to plant life than it was before irrigation development because of the salt accumulation and soil structure damage that irrigation caused. The improvement of land through irrigation created conditions that made the land less productive than it was in its natural state, representing a net loss of human welfare despite all the labor and resources invested in irrigation development. Cultural extinction accompanied environmental and economic collapse as the civilization that developed around irrigation agriculture disappeared, along with the water supplies that enabled it. The written language, religious practices, artistic traditions, and technical knowledge that accumulated over centuries were largely lost when the population dispersed and survivors focused on immediate survival rather than preserving cultural heritage. The archaeological evidence that remains includes the ruins of impressive irrigation infrastructure, the foundations of abandoned cities, and artifact assemblages that suggest a sophisticated civilization that achieved considerable technical and artistic accomplishments before disappearing from history. Future archaeologists will study these ruins and debate what caused the collapse, with most theories missing the fundamental point that the irrigation systems that enabled civilization growth also guaranteed its eventual destruction. The modern parallels to ancient irrigation failures are too obvious to ignore and too disturbing to fully accept. Contemporary irrigation systems in California's Central Valley, the American Southwest, and agricultural regions worldwide are repeating the same patterns that destroyed ancient civilizations' groundwater depletion, soil salinization, ecosystem destruction, and unsustainable water consumption that will eventually force major population displacements and economic restructuring. The Ogallala Aquifer that provides irrigation water for much of the American Great Plains is being depleted at rates that guarantee it will be effectively exhausted within decades, leaving one of the world's most productive agricultural regions without adequate water supplies. The depletion is happening despite full scientific understanding of aquifer hydrology and clear knowledge of the consequences of groundwater mining, suggesting that modern civilizations are just as capable of ignoring long-term sustainability concerns as ancient societies were. California's agricultural irrigation depends heavily on water transfers from distant watersheds and groundwater extraction that exceeds recharge rates, creating conditions that cannot be sustained indefinitely but generate such enormous short-term profits that changing course seems politically and economically impossible until collapse forces change through crisis rather than planning. The Colorado River, once a major waterway that reached the ocean, now typically runs dry before reaching its delta because irrigation and urban water demands consume the entire flow. The river that carved the Grand Canyon has been reduced to a managed plumbing system that serves human needs while destroying the ecosystem that the river supported for millions of years before irrigation development. Climate change is reducing snowpack in mountain watersheds that provide water for irrigation systems throughout the western United States, creating conditions where water supplies will decrease precisely when agricultural demand increases due to higher temperatures and longer growing seasons. The climate shifts will stress irrigation systems that are already operating at or beyond sustainable capacity, forcing choices between agricultural production and human habitability. Political conflicts over water resources are intensifying as competition increases for limited supplies that cannot serve all existing users, let alone accommodate population growth and economic development. The water wars that destroyed ancient civilizations are being replayed in contemporary contexts with modern technology, but similar fundamental dynamics where upstream users control water access and downstream users suffer the consequences. Technological optimism suggests that modern engineering can solve water scarcity problems through desalination, water recycling, and efficiency improvements. But the scale of water consumption in contemporary irrigation systems exceeds anything that alternative water sources can realistically provide. The technologies exist to extend irrigation viability, but they cannot support indefinite expansion of water consumption in regions that lack adequate natural water supplies. As your final week in the irrigation construction crew ends, you understand that the canal systems you helped build represent both humanity's greatest agricultural achievement and its most catastrophic environmental failure. The irrigation technology that enabled civilization development also guaranteed civilizational collapse through processes that were invisible to ancient people but should be obvious to contemporary societies that have access to historical examples and scientific understanding. Tonight, you'll sleep in a world where irrigation continues expanding, despite overwhelming evidence that current water consumption patterns are unsustainable and will eventually force major population displacements, comparable to those that destroyed ancient civilizations. Tomorrow will bring new opportunities to witness how technological progress can solve immediate problems while creating larger challenges that threaten the continuation of the very civilizations that technology was meant to serve. The ancient irrigation systems lie abandoned and useless, monuments to human ambition that exceeded environmental constraints and paid the inevitable price of unsustainability. The modern irrigation systems continue operating at full capacity, serving contemporary needs while establishing conditions that guarantee future collapse through the same processes that destroyed ancient predecessors. Sweet dreams of sustainable water management, climate-adapted agriculture, and population stabilization at levels that can be supported by renewable resources. The irrigation systems that humanity continues building represent the same gamble that ancient civilizations made and lost, betting that technological innovation can overcome environmental limits despite all historical evidence suggesting otherwise.